In the cold, technical anatomy of a military disaster, there is a specific moment where the theoretical meets the physical. On the morning of September 17, 1944, that moment was represented by the deployment of the X-type parachute. It was a masterpiece of textile engineering. 28 panels of high-grade silk or nylon, 120 square feet of fabric designed to do one thing: defeat gravity for exactly 35 seconds. The parachute is the ultimate expression of military optimism. It is a fragile, translucent contract between the soldier and the sky. It promises a rapid, vertical entry into the battle space, bypassing the slow, bloody geography of a ground offensive. But the parachute is also a one-way door. Once the silk unfurls, the soldier is committed to a medium he cannot control, heading toward a ground he has not yet secured. Operation Market Garden was the largest airborne operation in human history. It was a plan of such staggering industrial scale that it seemed to possess its own gravity. 35,000 men were to be dropped into the German-occupied Netherlands. The objective was a carpet of silk, a series of airborne landings designed to seize a 60-mile corridor of bridges, culminating in the massive steel span at Arnhem. To Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the logic was indisputable. The German army in the West was a shattered force. After the collapse in Normandy and the race across France, the Wehrmacht was, in the eyes of Allied intelligence, a chaotic collection of elderly conscripts and demoralized survivors. Market Garden was the Sledgehammer, designed to end the war by Christmas. By seizing the bridges, the Allies would bypass the formidable Siegfried Line and strike directly into the Ruhr, the industrial heart of the Third Reich. This was the philosophy of the silk. It was a belief in the speed of the elite, the vertical envelopment that renders conventional defense obsolete.
The paratrooper was the first-day soldier, a specialist designed for the initial shock, not for the grinding attrition of a siege. If you appreciate this objective dissection of military logic and the structural mechanics of historical turning points, consider subscribing to the channel. We strip away the cinematic polish to examine the cold variables that decide the fate of empires, away from the noise of typical historical narratives. The planning of Market Garden was conducted in an atmosphere of strategic inebriation. Success had become a habit for the Allied High Command. When the Dutch resistance and the clandestine Ultra intercepts began to report the arrival of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions near Arnhem, the information was not integrated into the plan. It was filtered. To the Allied planners, the presence of German tanks was a statistical anomaly. They were refitting units, broken shells of divisions that posed no real threat to the airborne elite. This is the bureaucracy of denial. When a system commits to a large-scale project, it begins to view contradictory data as a form of interference. The intelligence officers at SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, did not ignore the photos of German tanks because they were incompetent. They ignored them because the tanks did not fit the geometry of the victory. The silk was already being packed into the chutes. The momentum of the machine was irreversible. On the other side of the Rhine, the German perspective was not one of demoralization, but of systemic recovery. Field Marshal Walter Model, known as the Führer's fireman, had arrived in the Netherlands just days before the drop. Model was a master of the Kampfgruppe, battle group logic. He understood that in a collapsing front, a formal divisional structure is a liability. You need ad hoc efficiency. Collecting survivors from 100 different units, putting them under a competent NCO, and giving them a single, clear objective. The Germans were not fighting for a 1,000-year Reich in September 1944. They were fighting for cohesion. Every bridge held was another day of survival for the interior. When the thousands of shoots began to bloom in the sky over Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem, the Germans did not panic. They triggered the Alarmstufe, the highest state of alert. They moved toward the silk not with fear, but with the cold pragmatism of professionals clearing a wreckage. The market part of the operation, the airborne drop, was a masterpiece of logistical coordination. From the air, the sight of 10,000 parachutes was an industrialized miracle. It was the visual manifestation of Allied dominance. But as the silk touched the Dutch soil, the garden part, the ground advance of the British 33rd Corps, faced the physics of the single road. The corridor to Arnhem was a 60-mile ribbon. It was a single, elevated two-lane highway surrounded by marshes and polder land. In the logic of the tank commander, this was a gully. If the lead vehicle was hit, the entire 60-mile column stopped. The armor was a prisoner of the geography. Montgomery's plan relied on the clockwork perfection of the link-up. The paratroopers were told to hold the bridges for 2 days. This was the contract of the sky. We deliver you to the bridge. You hold it for 48 hours. The tanks arrive. The war ends. It was an elegant linear equation. But war is not linear. War is fractal. The first failure was the sensory breakdown. The British 1st Airborne Division, dropped at Arnhem, carried the Type 22 radio set. It was a piece of high-tech equipment for its time, but it had a fatal flaw. It was not designed for urban concrete or wet woodlands. The iron-rich soil of the Netherlands and the dense brickwork of the Arnhem suburbs began to absorb the radio waves. Within 2 hours of landing, the thinking soldier was blind and deaf. Major General Roy Urquhart, commanding the 1st Airborne, found himself in a command vacuum. He could not talk to his brigades. He could not talk to the ground forces 60 miles away. He was the commander of a division that had effectively fragmented into 10,000 individual struggles. The parachute, once the symbol of his power, was now a silk shroud for his communications. In the comments, we want to hear your perspective. In a large-scale military operation, is it the failure of the technology, the radio, or the failure of the philosophy, the single-road gamble, that ultimately causes the collapse of the system? As the sun began to set on the first day, the British 2nd Parachute Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, reached the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge. They were the only ones. The rest of the division was being chewed up in the suburbs by the Kampfgruppen that Allied intelligence said didn't exist. Frost's men occupied the brick houses overlooking the ramp. They set up their Bren guns and their Piat anti-tank weapons. They looked south, across the 600-meter span of the bridge, waiting to see the silk of the other brigades or the steel of the 33rd Corps. They saw neither. They saw the 9th SS Reconnaissance Battalion, German armored cars and half-tracks, roaring onto the bridge from the south. The refitting units were moving at a tempo the British had not anticipated. The shattered force was striking back. The battle for the bridge had begun. It was supposed to last 2 days. It would last 9.
And the silk that had carried them there would soon be used for a very different purpose, as bandages for men who were realizing that the tanks were not coming. The transition from the illusion of the vertical victory to the reality of the horizontal siege was complete. The first-day soldier was now a last-stand soldier. As we move into Part 2, we will examine the anatomy of the urban trap, how the British paratroopers turned the houses of Arnhem into fortresses, and how the German Kampfgruppe logic began to systematically dismantle the airborne elite, house by house, brick by brick. The silk was tearing, and the steel was nowhere to be seen. The war would not be over by Christmas, and the garden was becoming a graveyard. The silence that followed the initial drop of the 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a
Systemic reset. As the 10,000 parachutes settled into the heathlands at Wolfhetze and Edda, 8 miles from the Arnhem Bridge, the British paratrooper entered a state of environmental shock. For weeks they had lived in the high-decibel, high-octane environment of airfields in England. Now they were on the ground, in a country where the only sound was the rustle of the wind through the pines and the distant, rhythmic clank of a church bell. The transition from the sky to the street is the most vulnerable period for an airborne unit. They are, for a few hours, a collection of individuals rather than a cohesive military force. They must find their rendezvous points, locate their heavy equipment containers, often dropped hundreds of meters away, and reorganize into their tactical bricks. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Battalion was the only element of the 1st Airborne to reach the primary objective on that first evening. They had bypassed the main roads, moving through the backyards and narrow lanes of the Oosterbeek suburbs.
When they arrived at the northern ramp of the Arnhem Bridge at 2000 hours on September 17th, they found a steel structure that was more than a crossing. It was a geopolitical pivot. The Arnhem Bridge was a massive, arching spine of grey steel, spanning 600 meters across the lower Rhine. In the logic of the Garden Plan, this bridge was the exit. Once the tanks of 30th Corps crossed this span, the German defense in the west would be structurally decapitated. Frost's 500 men occupied the sturdy brick houses overlooking the ramp, turning the elegant residences of Dutch doctors and lawyers into vertical fortresses. They knocked out windows, sandbagged attics, and positioned their Bren guns to cover the 600-meter field of fire that was the bridge's deck. They were elite. They were the product of a selection process that valued aggressive initiative and physical endurance. But as the sun set over the Rhine, the first-day soldier began to realize that the 2-day contract was already being renegotiated by the enemy. On the southern side of the bridge, the 9th SS Reconnaissance Battalion, led by Hauptsturmführer Victor Grabner, was returning from a scouting mission. Grabner was a veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who operated on the Kampfgruppe philosophy of violence as information. When his armored cars reached the southern ramp, they didn't see a shattered force. They saw the muzzles of British rifles in the windows of the northern houses. Grabner's reaction was not one of demoralized retreat. It was a probe. He ordered his armored cars to charge across the bridge. It was a test of the British defensive density. If you appreciate this granular examination of the friction of war, the moment where the silk of the parachute is replaced by the grit of the brick, please like the video. Your support helps us maintain this cold, objective look at history's most decisive collapses. The engagement on the bridge was a study in ballistic contrast. The German armored cars, SDKFZ 234/2 Pumas, were masterpieces of mobile armor, mounting 50mm cannons. The British paratroopers had the Piat, Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. The Piat was a weapon born of operational desperation. It was essentially a massive spring-loaded catapult that launched a 2-pound shaped charge bomb. It had a maximum effective range of 100 meters. To use a Piat against an armored car on an open bridge required the soldier to wait until the vehicle was close enough to see the commander's goggles. It required a psychological stillness that conventional training cannot produce. Frost's men held their fire until the lead German car was 18 meters away. Then the geometry of the ambush was triggered. The first Piat round struck the Puma's wheel arch, the shaped charge jet punching through the light armor and incinerating the interior. The bridge became a channel of fire. The British Bren guns began to rake the open-topped half-tracks following the Pumas. Grabner's battalion was repulsed, leaving a trail of burning steel on the ramp.
But the German systemic recovery was accelerating. While Frost held the bridge, the rest of the 1st Airborne Division was experiencing a fractal collapse. The 1st and 3rd Battalions, attempting to reach the bridge to reinforce Frost, were caught in the Spindler Kampfgruppe net. Obersturmbannführer Ludwig Spindler had collected clerks, cooks, and a few survivors from the 9th SS Panzer Division and established a blocking line along the Utrecht-Arnhem road.
This is the logic of the scrap heap. Spindler didn't have a cohesive division. He had a mobile rubble. He used the dense Dutch woods and the brick houses as force multipliers. Every time a British company attempted to advance, they were met by a sniper and a machine gun, the fundamental unit of the German defensive DNA. The British paratroopers, trained for shock and movement, found themselves in a statics duel. They were being forced to fight for every garden gate, every hedgerow, and every attic. Their momentum, the primary asset of an airborne unit, was being bled away by a series of micro-engagements. In the comments, we want to hear your perspective. When an elite unit like the 1st Airborne loses its tempo, is it possible to regain it? Or is the airborne doctrine fundamentally a one-shot weapon that fails the moment it meets a prepared defense? In the center of this chaos, Major General Roy Urquhart was living the command nightmare. His Type 22 radios were silent. The iron-rich soil and the brick walls were absorbing the signals, creating a command void. Urquhart, a man of action who had never commanded an airborne division in combat before, made a functional error. He left his headquarters to see for himself what was happening at the front. By doing so, the commander of the division became just another soldier in a street fight. He was eventually cut off by German patrols and forced to hide in the attic of a Dutch civilian's house for 24 hours. The brain of the division was now in an attic. The limbs, the battalions, were fighting separate, uncoordinated wars, and the steel, 30 Corps, was still 30 miles to the south, struggling with the physics of the single road. Highway 69, the Garden Road, had earned its name, Hell's Highway. It was a ribbon of asphalt raised above the surrounding marshland. General Brian Horrocks, commanding 30 Corps, was attempting to push an entire armored division, hundreds of tanks and thousands of trucks, up this single line. The Germans understood the ribbon logic. They didn't need to defeat the British Army. They just needed to clip the ribbon. Small teams of German infantry with Panzerfausts, disposable anti-tank weapons, would hide in the woods, wait for the lead tank to pass, and hit the 3rd or 4th vehicle in the column. The garden would stop. The tanks would have to wait for the infantry to clear the woods. The infantry would have to wait for the artillery to range the targets. The clockwork perfection of Montgomery's plan was being dismantled by the friction of the polder. By the morning of September 18th, the contract of the sky had expired. The paratroopers at Arnhem Bridge had been on the ground for 24 hours. Their silk was being repurposed. The paratroopers began to use the white silk of their parachutes as signals. They laid them out in the gardens of the houses to identify their positions to the RAF supply drops that were supposed to arrive. But the command vacuum meant that the RAF pilots were flying to preset coordinates based on the original plan, not the actual reality of the battle. The supply canisters, containing the food, water, and ammunition that Frost's men desperately needed, fell directly into the German-held areas of the city. The system was now feeding the enemy. The paratroopers also began to use the silk as bandages. The medical situation in the houses near the bridge was turning medieval. Without surgical teams or hospitals,
the medics were using strips of parachute silk to tie off arterial bleeds and pack shrapnel wounds.
The translucent fabric, designed for the grace of flight, was now soaked in the grit of the earth. This is the transformation of the symbol. The parachute was no longer a tool of victory, it was a marker of the siege. As the second day of the operation progressed, Field Marshal Walter Model arrived in Arnhem to oversee the liquidations of the British pockets. Model was a technocrat of attrition. He didn't order a massed heroic charge into the British houses. He ordered industrial demolition. He brought in heavy artillery and Sturmgeschütz, assault guns. He told his commanders, "Don't fight them in the rooms. Collapse the rooms on top of them." The German philosophy was to treat the British paratroopers not as soldiers, but as a structural infestation. They began to systematically level the houses surrounding the bridge ramp. They used 88mm flak guns in a direct fire roll, punching holes through the 2-foot-thick Dutch brickwork and detonating the interiors. Frost's men were being pressed. The geometry of the defense was shrinking with every hour. But the paratroopers held. They moved through the mouse holes they had knocked through the interior walls of the houses, shifting their positions to avoid the German shells. They were living on adrenaline and tea, the two fuels of the British infantrymen. They still believed in the garden. They still believed that at any moment the Sherman tanks of the Guards Armored Division would appear on the southern ramp of the bridge, ending the siege and winning the war. They didn't know that Horrocks and 30th Corps were still fighting for the bridge at Nijmegen, 10 miles to the south. They didn't know that the single road had become a graveyard of armor. And they didn't know that the silk they were using for bandages was the last supply they would ever receive.
As we move into part 3, we will examine the collapse of the illusion, how the arrival of the 10th SS Panzer Division at the bridge changed the physics of the combat, and how the British 1st Airborne Division began its long, bloody retreat into the Oosterbeek perimeter. The garden was failing, and the silk was being stained a permanent dark red. The 2-day contract was now a suicide pact, and the bridge at Arnhem was becoming a monument to the price of high expectations. The steel was closing in, and the sky was empty. The architecture of abandonment. By the dawn of Tuesday, September 19, 1944, the mathematical model of Operation Market Garden had suffered a terminal fracture. In the clinical language of military logistics, the lead time had expired. The British 1st Airborne Division had been on the ground for over 48 hours. According to the strategic contract signed in England, this was the moment of relief. This was the second where the light, vertical force was supposed to be absorbed by the heavy, horizontal mass of the XXX Corps. But the horizon to the south remained a flat, silent line of Dutch polder. There was no rhythmic clank of Sherman tracks. There was no silhouette of the Guards Armored Division. There was only the acoustic signature of the German counteroffensive, a low-frequency growl of heavy diesel engines, and the persistent high-velocity crack of the 88mm flak guns. The parachute silk, once the bright white and camouflage green symbol of a new way of war, was now undergoing a functional degradation. In the gardens of Oosterbeek and the rubble of Arnhem, the silk was being reclaimed by the mud. It was no longer a tool of flight, it was a filter. The paratroopers, cut off from their water supplies, began to use strips of parachute silk to strain the grey, sandy water from the wells of the Hartenstein Hotel. They were trying to separate the grit of the earth from the moisture of life. This is the entropy of the elite. An airborne division is a high-energy system that requires constant injections of supplies to maintain its structural integrity. Without those injections, the system begins to self-cannibalize. The paratrooper, stripped of his mobility and his communications,
reverts to a more primitive state, a stationary observer in a landscape of fire. If you appreciate this objective dissection of the friction of war, the moment where the silk of the parachute is replaced by the grit of the brick, please like the video. Your support helps us maintain this cold, objective look at history's most decisive collapses. At the Arnhem Bridge, the geometry of the siege had become a nightmare of direct fire. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Battalion was now holding a perimeter that was measured not in city blocks, but in individual rooms. The houses they occupied, elegant structures built for the Dutch merchant class, were being systematically deconstructed by the 10th SS Panzer Division. The German commander, Brigadeführer Heinz Harmel, had abandoned the infantry assault logic. He realized that the British paratrooper, when entrenched in a brick house with a Bren gun, possessed a defensive efficiency that made a frontal charge a waste of manpower. Harmel switched to the industrialization of attrition. He brought in Tiger II tanks, 68-ton monsters of steel and fire, and Sturmgeschütz assault guns. The Tiger II did not fight the paratroopers. It erased their cover. From a range of 400 meters, beyond the reach of the British Piats, the Tiger's 88mm gun would fire a high-explosive shell through the front wall of a house, exiting through the back wall and detonating the entire internal structure. The British paratroopers were being evicted by high explosives.
They moved through the mouse holes, the tunnels they had hacked through the party walls of the terrace houses. They lived in the basements, among the stored coal and the winter preserves of the Dutch civilians. They were subterranean soldiers, moving only when a house became a thermal trap, a structure so engulfed in fire that the air itself became a poison. The silk was now the only medical supply left. The paratroopers used the suspension lines of the parachutes as tourniquets and the fabric as shrouds. When a man died in the basement of a house on the Arnhem ramp, he was wrapped in the same silk that had carried him into the sky. The parachute had become a circular narrative. It brought them to the battle, it bandaged their wounds, and it covered their remains. In the center of the city, the command vacuum had been partially filled, but the result was a fractured strategy. Major General Roy Urquhart, having escaped the attic where he had been trapped, returned to his headquarters at the Hartenstein Hotel in Oosterbeek. He looked at his maps and realized he was no longer commanding a division. He was commanding a horseshoe. The Oosterbeek perimeter was a defensive arc 3 miles long and 2 miles wide, with its back to the lower Rhine. It was a geographic cul-de-sac. Urquhart ordered the 1st and 3rd Battalions, which had been shredded in their attempt to reach Frost at the bridge, to retreat into this perimeter. The retreat was a study in tactical dissolution. The paratroopers had to move through the narrow, wooded lanes of Oosterbeek under the constant sniping of the German Kampfgruppen.
The Germans were using infiltration tactics, moving small teams of MG-42 machine gunners through the shadows, cutting the British files into isolated segments. By the evening of September 19th, the 1st Airborne Division was no longer an aggressive force. It was a biological entity, attempting to survive a chemical reaction. The German reaction was the systematic application of mortars and artillery. The Germans moved their 105mm and 150mm howitzers into the woods surrounding the Hartenstein. They didn't need precision. They were firing into a target-rich environment. Every shell that landed in the Oosterbeek horseshoe was guaranteed to hit a house, a slit trench, or a medical station. The British thinking soldier was being reduced to a statistic of probability. In the comments, we want to hear your perspective. When a commander like Urquhart realizes the plan has failed, is the moral obligation to continue the mission at all costs,
or to preserve the lives of his men through a tactical withdrawal, even if that withdrawal means admitting a strategic defeat. As the sun set on the third day, the tragedy of the supply drop occurred. This is the moment that defines the systemic failure of Market Garden. The RAF, operating on preset flight paths and obsolete intelligence, sent 163 Sterling and Dakota transport aircraft to drop supplies to the 1st Airborne. The pilots were told to drop their containers onto Supply Drop Zone 5, a field that the British had planned to occupy on day 1. But Drop Zone 5 was now firmly in the hands of the German 9th SS Panzer Division. The British paratroopers in the Oosterbeek perimeter watched from their slit trenches as the hundreds of supply chutes, carrying the food, the blood plasma, and the 75mm shells they desperately needed, drifted slowly and gracefully into the German lines. It was a gift of silk to the enemy. The paratroopers attempted to signal the aircraft.
They used yellow smoke, they used signal mirrors, they even ran into the open fields, waving their arms as the German machine guns mowed them down. But the RAF pilots had been ordered to ignore ground signals to avoid being lured into traps by German decoys. The bureaucracy of the plan was now a suicide note. The pilots followed their orders with a heroic rigidity, flying through a wall of German flak to deliver 90% of the division's supplies directly to the Wehrmacht. Watching your own life support fall into the hands of the man trying to kill you is a specific form of psychological trauma. It breaks the contract of the system. The paratrooper realizes that the great machine in England is no longer looking at him. It is looking at a map that no longer exists. At the Arnhem Bridge, John Frost was wounded. A mortar shell exploded near his position, peppered his legs with shrapnel. He sat in the basement of his headquarters, his legs wrapped in silk bandages, listening to the industrial grinding of the German tanks. He knew the garden was dead. The tanks of 30th Corps were still 10 miles away, stopped at the bridge in Nijmegen. The single road had become a constricted artery. The blood of the Allied offensive was no longer reaching the brain at Arnhem. Frost looked at his remaining men. They were black. No ammunition, no water, no morphine. They were holding the northern ramp with bayonets and psychological refusal. But refusal cannot stop a 68-ton Tiger II. The Germans began to use incendiary shells. They were no longer trying to collapse the houses, they were trying to liquidate the interiors with fire. The brick fortresses of Arnhem were becoming ovens. The paratroopers had to make a binary choice: burn in the basement or surrender on the street. The silk of the parachute made its final appearance at the bridge. The British medics took the white silk from a supply chute and tied it to a stick. They stepped out of the burning rubble, holding the white silk of surrender. The battle for the bridge was over. It had lasted 3 days and 3 nights. Out of the 740 men who had reached the bridge, only a handful were still standing. The rest were wrapped in silk in the gardens or lying in the charnel houses of the basements. The German commanders, Bittrich and Hamel, treated the captured paratroopers with a professional respect. They were fellow elites. They offered the British officers cigarettes and schnapps. It was the chivalry of the rubble, a brief, hollow moment of humanity before the industrialization of the kill resumed. But the 1st Airborne Division was not yet dead. It was still breathing in the horseshoe at Oosterbeek, and the garden was still attempting one final desperate infection. As we move into Part 4, we will examine the agony of the horseshoe, how the Oosterbeek perimeter became a laboratory of endurance, and how the silk became the only thing separating the survivors from the lethal entropy of the German artillery. The garden was failing, and the steel was turning away. The Christmas illusion was gone,
and the silk was being buried under the cold Dutch rain. The final surrender was still 5 days away, and the cost was about to become unspeakable. The machine was broken, and the phantoms of the sky were now the rats of the earth. The geometry of the horseshoe. On the morning of Wednesday, September 20th, 1944, the British 1st Airborne Division ceased to be a military force of vertical envelopment and became a biological enclave. The fall of the Arnhem Bridge to the 10th SS Panzer Division had effectively decapitated the operation. The exit was closed. The 700 men under John Frost were being marched into captivity, leaving the remaining 3,000 paratroopers compressed into a pocket of land 3 miles wide and 2 miles deep. The Oosterbeek perimeter.
To a strategic observer, the Oosterbeek horseshoe was a tactical absurdity. It was a defensive arc with its back to the lower Rhine, a river 400 meters wide with a current of 5 knots. In the logic of the Garden Plan, the Rhine was a highway to be crossed. In the reality of the siege, the Rhine was a moat that trapped the defenders. The British were no longer holding a corridor, they were holding a wait room for the grave. The Hartenstein Hotel, a white stuccoed mansion that had once been a symbol of Dutch upper-class leisure, was now the nervous system of the perimeter. Major General Roy Urquhart sat in the basement, surrounded by maps that were becoming increasingly irrelevant. His thinking soldiers were now static sensors, spread thin across the gardens, woods, and tennis courts of the hotel grounds. The parachute silk made its most visceral transition here. It was no longer the white canopy of the sky. It had become the grey shroud of the earth. The constant rain of the Dutch autumn, mixed with the fine white dust of pulverized brick and the black soot of burning phosphorus, had stained the silk a uniform, necrotic grey. The paratroopers used the silk to line their slit trenches, attempting to create a vapor barrier against the rising groundwater of the polders. They failed. The silk, designed to breathe in the high-altitude air, became a cold compress, holding the freezing moisture against the soldier's skin. If you appreciate this clinical examination of the friction of war, the moment where the silk of the parachute is replaced by the grit of the brick, please like the video. Your support helps us maintain this cold, objective look at history's most decisive collapses. The German system of liquidations had now reached its industrial peak. Field Marshal Walter Model had moved his heavy assets into the woods surrounding Oosterbeek. He did not seek a clash of elites. He sought the mechanical neutralization of the pocket. The primary tool of this neutralization was the Nebelwerfer, the multi-barreled rocket launcher that the British called Moaning Minnie. The Nebelwerfer was a weapon of psychological saturation. It did not fire a single shell. It fired a salvo of 6 rockets that shrieked through the air, detonating in a pattern that ensured total coverage of a specific hectare. The paratroopers in the Oosterbeek woods lived in a vertical cemetery. The German shells were fused for tree bursts. When a shell hit the top of a 100-year-old pine, it didn't bury itself in the dirt. It exploded 60 feet above the ground, raining down a curtain of steel and wooden shrapnel. The paratroopers' slit trenches, designed to protect them from horizontal fire, were useless against this top-down geometry. The thinking soldier was forced to adapt to the logic of the mole. They dug deeper. They covered their trenches with doors ripped from Dutch villas and logs from the fallen pines. They lived in the dark, breathing the scent of wet pine and decaying silk. In the comments, we want to hear your perspective. In a siege like Oosterbeek, does the elite status of a unit like the 1st Airborne become a liability?
Does their training for aggression hinder their ability to endure the passive attrition of a stationary defense? The medical situation at the Hartenstein was a descent into the pre-modern. Colonel Graham Warwick, the division's senior medical officer, had established a charnel house in the hotel's dressing stations. He was treating over 1,000 casualties with a supply of morphine and bandages that had been exhausted 48 hours earlier. The silk was the only resource left. The medics moved through the basements with parachute knives, cutting strips of silk from the supply canisters that had fallen within the perimeter.
This silk suture was the only thing holding the division together. Without antibiotics or sterile equipment, Warwick was performing amputations with saws that were cleaned only with the dregs of Dutch gin. The paratroopers were paying the price of the single road. To the south, at Nijmegen, the garden was finally moving. The US 82nd Airborne and the British 33rd Corps had finally seized the Nijmegen Bridge in a heroic, high-visibility river crossing. But the mechanical friction of the German defense had cost the Allies 3 days. In the clinical logic of the Garden Plan, those 3 days were strategic interest that the 1st Airborne could not afford to pay. Horrocks and 10th Corps were now only 10 miles from Arnhem, but those 10 miles were a tunnel of fire. The 10th SS Panzer Division had established a blocking line at Elst, halfway between the two bridges. The steel was stopped. The silk was shredded, and the Rhine was a barrier of liquid lead. On Thursday, September 21st, the tragedy of the Polish Brigade added a new layer of systemic chaos. Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski and his 1st Polish Independent Parachute Brigade were finally dropped at Driel, on the southern bank of the Rhine, directly opposite the Osterbeek horseshoe. The logic of the drop was sound. The Poles would cross the river in boats and reinforce Urquhart's perimeter. But the friction intervened again. The boats, the dinghies of silk and rubber, had not arrived with the tanks. They were stuck 20 miles to the south in the logistical tail of the 33rd Corps. Sosabowski's men stood on the southern bank, looking across 400 meters of water at the smoking ruins of Osterbeek. They were so close they could hear the moaning minis landing on their comrades. But without the medium of crossing, they were as isolated as if they were back in England. The Germans, meanwhile, had reached the stage of total envelopment. They moved their snipers into the shattered upper floors of the Oosterbeek villas. These were industrial snipers, men who didn't fire at officers. They fired at activity. If a paratrooper moved to a well for water, he was shot. If a medic moved a casualty, he was shot. The geometry of the perimeter was being compressed by a curtain of precision. By Friday, September 22nd, the 1st Airborne Division had entered the hallucinatory phase of the siege. They were living on a diet of raw sugar and rainwater filtered through silk. Sleep was a statistical impossibility. The constant overpressure from the artillery was causing brain bruising, a state where the soldier can no longer distinguish between the sound of a shell and the sound of his own pulse. Major General Urquhart, looking through the windows of the Hartenstein, saw his division dissolving. He saw men who had been the elite of the sky now sitting in the dirt, staring at their boots with 1,000-yard stares. The system had reached its elastic limit. He realized that the garden would never reach them. The single road had failed. The bridge too far was not a geographic point. It was a logistical impossibility. He requested permission to withdraw. But the bureaucracy of the plan was still operating. Montgomery, in his headquarters at Brussels, still believed the garden could be saved. He ordered the 1st Airborne to hold at all costs. He was trading the lives of the paratroopers for strategic posture.
He wanted the Rhine bridgehead to remain visible on the map, even if the men holding it were invisible under the ground. This is the cruelty of the map. To a field marshal, a perimeter is a shape. To a paratrooper, a perimeter is a basement full of screams and the smell of rotted silk. The final, systemic insult occurred on the night of September 23rd.
A small element of the Polish brigade attempted to cross the Rhine using improvised rafts and a few rubber dinghies that had finally arrived. They were caught in the searchlight net. The Germans had positioned massive power projectors along the northern bank. As the silk and rubber boats entered the water, the world turned artificial white. The German MG-42s, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute, turned the Rhine into a kill zone of water and lead. Out of the 200 Poles who attempted the crossing, only 50 reached the horseshoe. The reinforcements were a blood sacrifice that achieved nothing. Urquhart looked at his silk bandages. He looked at the grey silk of the rain. He realized that the only way to save the survivors was to murder the plan. He had to execute an unauthorized extraction. He began to plan Operation Berlin, the night withdrawal across the Rhine. But there was a problem. The Rhine was controlled by the German acoustic net. Any mass movement of men toward the river would be detected by the German hydrophones and the industrial snipers. The British paratrooper, who had entered the war as a phantom from the sky, would have to leave it as a ghost in the water. They began to prepare the silk. They took the remaining strips of parachute silk and wrapped them around their boots. They wrapped them around the metal buckles of their webbing. They wrapped them around the bolts of their rifles. They were attempting to muffle the machine. The silk was now the silence. As we move into Part 5, we will examine the agony of the river, the final freezing crossing under the German flares, and the long, silent aftermath for the men who returned. We will look at why the garden was called a success by the men who planned it, and a graveyard by the men who fought it. The silk was almost gone.
And the Rhine was waiting to claim its final body count.
The 17-second drop had turned into a 9-day drowning, and the bridge was still a mile away and a century out of reach. The system was done, and the rats were trying to swim. On the night of Monday, September 25, 1944, the British 1st Airborne Division reached its point of absolute saturation. For 9 days, the division had existed as a high-intensity biological anomaly within a landscape of industrial fire. Of the 10,000 men who had descended on the Silk 9 days earlier, only 2,500 were still capable of standing in a slit trench. The rest had been processed by the German machine, killed in the brick ruins of Arnhem, wounded in the basements of Oosterbeek, or captured in the command vacuums of the suburbs. The decision to execute Operation Berlin, the night withdrawal across the lower Rhine, was not an act of military choice. It was a structural necessity. The Oosterbeek perimeter was no longer a defensive position. It was a geometry of attrition, where the German artillery had mapped every square meter. Major General Roy Urquhart realized that if his men stayed for another 24 hours, the 1st Airborne would cease to exist even as a memory. The garden had not reached them. The single road had remained a logistical bottleneck. The Silk contract was officially null and void. The withdrawal was planned for 2,100 hours. It was to be a silent extraction, a ghost walk through a landscape saturated with German acoustic sensors. To achieve this, the paratroopers turned one last time to the material that had defined their existence, the parachute silk. They took the blood-stained, mud-caked strips of silk from their bandages and their supply chutes and began the muffling of the machine.
They wrapped the silk around their heavy ammunition boots to dampen the crunch of gravel.
They wrapped it around the swivels of their Enfield rifles to stop the metallic click of the slings. They wrapped it around the handles of their shovels and the buckles of their webbing. The paratrooper, who had entered the war as a scream from the sky, was leaving it as a whisper in the rain. The silk, designed to catch the wind and announce a presence, was now being used to stifle the signal. If you have followed this clinical dissection of the friction of war and the cold reality of systemic collapse from the sky to the river, this is our final chapter. Consider subscribing to the channel. We prioritize the structural variables of history over the manufactured drama of the mainstream, examining how the thinking soldier survives when the machine of the state fails him. The geometry of the withdrawal was as precise as it was desperate. The paratroopers were to move in single file, holding onto the smock of the man in front of them. They followed a line of white tape, and where the tape ran out, they used strips of white parachute silk tied to the trees. These small, ghostly markers were the only navigation system left. They led the way from the Hartenstein Hotel down through the wooded ravines toward the northern bank of the Rhine. The Rhine was a medium of lethal entropy. It was 400 meters of black, churning water, illuminated by the artificial suns of German magnesium flares. The Germans, sensing the collapse of the horseshoe, had increased their sensory density. They fired their mortars at fixed intervals, creating a curtain of fire along the riverbank. They used their hydrophones, underwater microphones, to listen for the splashing of boats. The extraction was managed by the 23rd and 20th Canadian Field Companies. They arrived with storm boats, plywood craft with outboard motors. But the motors were too loud. They were acoustic magnets for German machine guns.
After the first few trips, the Canadians were forced to row. They used the silk to muffle the oarlocks, turning the mechanical thud of the wood into a soft thud that the wind could swallow. As you reflect on the mechanical silence required to survive a systemic disaster, please like the video and share your perspective in the comments. In the final assessment of a mission like Arnhem, who bears the greater responsibility? The planner who ignored the geography, or the commander who refused to admit the failure until the silk was the only thing left? The crossing was a nightmare of fluid dynamics. The current was moving at 5 knots, pulling the overloaded boats downstream toward the German-held railway bridge. The paratroopers sat in the boats, their silk-wrapped boots resting in 6 inches of freezing river water. They were motionless, thinking soldiers reduced to passive ballast. When the German flares ignited overhead, the world turned a searing chemical white. The paratroopers did not move. They knew that in the visual field of the German snipers, movement was the only thing that triggered a shot. They sat in the open boats, illuminated like statues, betting their lives on the invisibility of stasis. By the dawn of Tuesday, September 26th, the extraction was complete. 2,398 men had reached the southern bank. They were the walking wounded, men with basement eyes and silk bandages. They stood on the southern levee and looked back across the river. The horseshoe was gone. The Hartenstein was a German prize, and the thousands of men they had left behind, the wrapped in silk, were now prisoners of the Third Reich. The 1st Airborne Division had been structurally obliterated. Out of 10,000 men, 1,485 were dead and 6,414 were captured. The elite of the sky had been liquidated by the logic of the polder. But the final insult was not the casualty count. It was the strategic posture of the Allied command. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, in his official report to the War Office, described Operation Market Garden as a 90% success. He argued that the Allied forces had seized the bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen, and that the Arnhem Bridge was merely a bridge too far, a geographic detail that didn't detract from the overall momentum.
This is the mathematics of the bureaucrat. It is a logic that ignores the 10% fracture that kills the system. To a paratrooper who had survived the Oosterbeek oven, the idea of a 90% success was a psychological assault. It meant that their 9 days of surgical attrition were being rewritten as a minor deviation in a greater plan. The silk remains the ultimate squaznaya metaphora, through-line metaphor, for this great deception. When the British public saw the newsreels of the Arnhem survivors, they saw the heroic silk, the men returning with their red berets and their defiant expressions. They didn't see the necrotic silk in the basements. They didn't see the muffling silk in the mud. The parachute was transformed from a tool of failure into a symbol of resilience. The system saved itself by turning a logistical disaster into a national myth. But the thinking soldier knows the truth. The paratroopers of the 1st Airborne never truly recovered from the Arnhem logic. The division was never rebuilt to its full strength. It was retired from the order of battle in 1945, its silk folded away, its elite status preserved as a museum piece. The garden had effectively consumed the market. The Arnhem Bridge, the bridge too far, remained in German hands until April 1945. It was eventually destroyed by Allied bombers and then rebuilt in the 1950s. Today, it is called the John Frost Bridge. It is a monument of grey steel and concrete that carries thousands of cars a day across the Rhine.
But if you walk to the northern ramp of that bridge today, away from the traffic and the noise, and you look at the brick houses that have been rebuilt exactly as they were in 1944, you might notice something. In the autumn, when the Dutch rain is heavy and the wind blows from the North Sea, the trees near the riverbank often catch the debris of the season. Every few years, a local historian or a construction crew finds a fragment of white fabric buried deep in the mud of the polders or caught in the old brickwork of a basement. It is the silk. It is a translucent, durable fragment of the 17-second dream that died in 1944. The silk is the only thing that doesn't rot. It is the physical proof that the thinking soldier was there. It is the record of the grit, the blood, and the silence. The garden was a fantasy of the map. The silk was the reality of the earth. The 1st Airborne Division came from the sky to decapitate the enemy. Instead, they were digested by the environment. They learned that the parachute is not a guarantee of victory. It is a vulnerability of the high ground. They learned that the single road is a stranglehold. And they learned that when the machine fails, the only thing left is the silence of the silk. The 17 seconds of the drop were the last time the system worked. The 9 days that followed were the price of the illusion. The silk is still there, in the trees, in the mud, and in the folding of the brain of the few who came back. The success was 90%. The disaster was total, and the bridge was always out of reach. Thank you for your time. Your intelligence has been the only audience we sought. The record of the carpet of silk is now closed. But the wind through the pines, the wind still rustles like a parachute opening in the dark. And the garden is still waiting for its tanks. The end.